The glass is already sweating when the joke lands. Lowe's Angels mid-1940s, past midnight. A back booth pressed against dark wood paneling hidden from the room by cigarette smoke and the curve of the bar. The air smells like whiskey, stale perfume, and money that never has to ask permission. No one notices you at first, no one would. This is where men sit when they don't want to be seen being serious. A low laugh breaks out, then another. A match flares, someone leans back, chair legs scraping just a fraction too loudly against the tile. Billy Wilkerson is holding his drink loosely like it doesn't matter if he spills it. He's relaxed, almost bored, the kind of bored that comes from knowing exactly where you stand. He says it casually, almost lazily. Something about names. About troublemakers. About how easy it would be to print them. At first, it sounds like a joke, the kind men make after the third drink when the night feels private and the city feels owned. But the laughter doesn't spread. It stops. Not all at once. One man first, then another. A lawyer at the end of the booth lowers his glass without realizing he's doing it. The silence doesn't rush in. It settles. Eyes shift just slightly, not panic, not fear, calculation. Someone clears his throat, no words follow. Because everyone in this booth understands what was just offered, not as a threat, but as a reminder. Wilkerson doesn't smile right away, he lets the pause work for him. He knows this room. He knows how long silence can stretch before it becomes unbearable. The joke wasn't about printing names. It was about power. And power in this town doesn't need to raise its voice. A man across from him adjusts his tie. Another stares into his drink like the answer might be floating there. A studio executive who's had final cut written into every contract he's ever signed suddenly looks very small. Because if Wilkerson prints a list, it won't look like an attack. It will look official. Neutral. Factual. Clean. A column tucked into the trade paper everyone reads but pretends not to fear. Names, no accusations, no evidence, just implication. And in Hollywood, implication is enough. The booth feels tighter now, the way rooms do when no one moves but everyone feels watched. Wilkerson finally smiles, not wide, not sharp, controlled, polite, almost courteous. He lifts his glass slightly as if to soften it. I'm kidding, of course. No one laughs. Not because they don't understand humor, but because everyone understands leverage. These men greenlight movies, they sign contracts. They decide which faces appear on billboards and which names vanish between drafts of a script. They are used to being the final authority. But Wilkerson doesn't need authority over budgets or soundstages. He controls the mirror. The daily reflection of the industry looking back at itself. The trades aren't entertainment, they're oxygen. Actors read them in the morning with coffee. Agents scan them before their first call. Executives measure their reputations line by line, word by word. And once a reputation bends, it rarely straightens. Someone finally says something, it doesn't matter who. Careful, Billy. It's meant as a joke, it fails. Wilkerson tilts his head just a little, listening, considering. He doesn't answer right away. That's the second silence. This one is longer. In that pause, the men in the booth replay the last few years in their heads, who they crossed, who they froze out, who walked into an office hopeful and walked out quiet. Blacklists aren't official yet, not on paper, not openly. But everyone already knows how they work. A phone call that doesn't get returned. A meeting that never materializes. A project delayed indefinitely. And a name once associated with trouble spreads faster than truth. Wilkerson finally speaks again, soft. No harm meant. He means it. Which makes it worse. Because this isn't anger, this isn't revenge, this is administration. The booth is no longer a place to drink, it's a pressure chamber. One of the lawyers nods slowly, as if acknowledging a rule he's always known but never heard stated aloud. A studio man forces a smile that doesn't reach his eyes. They all understand the unspoken agreement of Hollywood: you can do almost anything as long as you don't disrupt the system. And the system runs on silence. Wilkerson drains his glass, sets it down gently, the sound is quiet, final. For a moment, just a moment, it feels like everything might return to normal, like the joke might dissolve back into laughter, into smoke, into nothing. But it doesn't. Because once power is named, even in jest, it can't be unheard. The men leave the booth one by one, no goodnights, no handshakes. The night outside suddenly feels colder, wider. Wilkerson stays seated, watching reflections move across the bar mirror. His expression gives nothing away. Tomorrow the paper will be printed. And most people will never know this conversation happened. But the decisions made in this booth will ripple outward quietly, into contracts, careers, and closed doors. Not because anyone was threatened, but because no one needed to be. And somewhere in the city, people who will never meet Billy Wilkerson will feel the consequences of a joke that wasn't really a joke at all. By morning, the booth doesn't exist anymore. It's been wiped down, the ashtrays emptied, the glasses rinsed clean. Sunlight catches on the bar mirror where nothing is recorded and everything is remembered. The city wakes up pretending nothing happened. But the men who sat there don't wake up the same. They dress more carefully, choose words more precisely, pause an extra second before making their first phone call of the day. Because silence doesn't end when you leave the room. It follows. Trade papers arrive on desks and doorsteps, folded, unassuming, no lists, no names, nothing out of place. That's what makes it worse. Hollywood is trained to watch for explosions, for headlines, for scandal, but this kind of pressure doesn't announce itself, it waits. In offices up and down Sunset Boulevard, conversations shift subtly. A name is mentioned and then gently redirected, a script discussed and then postponed. No one explains why. They don't have to. An agent hangs up after a call that should have gone better. A screenwriter hears the phrase "not right for us right now" for the third time in a week. An assistant quietly removes a folder from the top of a pile and places it lower. No memos. No orders. No paper trail. Just calibration. Billy Wilkerson doesn't need to print names to remind people what exposure feels like. He's already done the work. All it took was one joke delivered in the right room at the right time. The pressure moves sideways, never directly from him. Executives begin policing themselves. A studio head tells a subordinate to avoid unnecessary friction. A producer quietly advises a director to be careful what you say around town. Careful doesn't mean polite. It means invisible. The most dangerous part is what Wilkerson controls. It's what everyone else volunteers to surrender. Because once people believe something could be taken away, they start giving pieces of it up preemptively. At lunches, names are avoided. At parties, glances replace opinions. Men who once argued loudly now nod thoughtfully and say nothing. Silence becomes a currency. Wilkerson's column runs as usual, box office numbers, industry gossip softened just enough to look impartial, a single adjective here, a raised eyebrow implied there. Nothing actionable. Everything understood. People start noticing patterns, noticing who gets mentioned and who fades, who stays reliable and who becomes difficult. Words that don't accuse, words that suggest. And suggestions are safer than facts. In Hollywood, fact invites confrontation. Suggestion invites compliance. A lawyer from the booth bumps into a screenwriter he knows well. They exchange pleasantries. The lawyer hesitates, then leans in slightly. "Lay low," he says. That's it. No explanation, no threat, no context. It's enough. Because lay low implies someone is watching, even if no one is. This is how quiet systems enforce themselves, not by direction but by atmosphere. Wilkerson understands that better than most. He knows that authority works best when it feels ambient, like weather, something you adjust to rather than fight. He never calls anyone to follow up on the joke, never needs to. Others do it for him. Studio men reassure him of their respect. Industry figures invite him to lunches that weren't previously on the calendar. Someone casually mentions how important balance in reporting really is. Wilkerson listens, nods, takes notes he never shows anyone. The balance they're talking about isn't fairness. It's stability. And stability in this business means predictability. Anyone unpredictable becomes a liability. The fear isn't that names will be printed. The fear is that someone might become printable. A whisper goes through certain circles: Wilkerson is building something, a list, a memory, a ledger no one can see. True or not, it doesn't matter. Belief is the mechanism. Careers begin to slow without explanation. Calls go unanswered longer than usual. Invitations dry up. The phrase "we'll revisit this" becomes permanent. People begin adjusting their politics quietly, not because they agree, but because disagreement is exhausting when the walls don't echo it back. This is how blacklists exist before they exist. Not as policy, as instinct. Billy Wilkerson doesn't need to act, the room already did that for him. What started as a joke now lives as an unspoken rule: don't test the paper. In meetings, men talk around problems instead of nomming them. They laugh at safer jokes. They learn which silences to respect. Nobody ever stands up and says, "We are afraid." They say things like, "This is just how the town works," which makes it sound natural, inevitable, harmless. But beneath that surface, something hardens. A realization begins to settle into place, slow, uncomfortable, impossible to say aloud. This isn't about journalism. It's about visibility. Who is seen? Who is remembered? Who is allowed to exist without explanation? And the most frightening part isn't the loss of work. It's the loss of voice. Because once you understand that speaking can cost you everything, even quietly, you begin to measure every word against its potential price. By the time anyone thinks to push back, the pressure has already done its work, the boundaries have been internalized, the fear has become self-sustaining. Wilkerson sits at his desk, reading proofs, marking columns, moving through his day like nothing changed. And officially nothing did. No headlines screamed, no lists appeared, no scandal broke. But something irreversible has begun. A single joke has taught a room how to listen. And in Hollywood, once people learn to listen for danger, they rarely stop. The fear never announces its arrival. It settles in years later, quietly, when people try to remember when they stopped saying certain things out loud and can't. By the late 1940s, no one talks about that booth anymore. The men who sat there never mention it by name. Even privately, the memory has been stripped of specifics. Location fades, faces blur. But the lesson remains intact. People now assume lists exist even when none are printed. They behave as if someone is always tallying tone, loyalty, obedience. And that's when the real realization arrives, not suddenly, but like a slow tightening. The power was never the list. It was the possibility of one. Billy Wilkerson's influence doesn't peak with a headline or collapse in scandal. It diffuses into the culture. That's what makes it durable. He becomes a reference point in conversations he isn't present for. Careful. You never know how it'll look in the trades. Don't make enemies you don't need. No one says his name, they don't have to. By the time the Hollywood blacklist becomes public policy, hearings, testimony, names dragged into the open, many of the behaviors are already normalized. People are practiced at silence. They've rehearsed for this. Writers sign statements they don't believe in because they've already learned that belief is less important than placement. Actors distance themselves from friends with surgical efficiency. Producers justify cuts as business decisions. The language is clean, professional, bloodless. And when careers end, they don't end loudly. They fade. That fading is what Wilkerson understood long before it was widely acknowledged. You don't destroy people in Hollywood. You make them absent. A name that stops appearing. A photo that doesn't get published. A mention quietly removed before print. By the time someone realizes they're disappearing, the mechanisms that could have helped them are already closed. Years later, some of the men from that booth watch the blacklist machine operate in daylight, congressional hearings, newsreels, public disgrace, and feel a strange, private discomfort. Not guilt. Recognition. They've seen the shape before. They've felt this pressure without witnesses. What shocks them isn't the cruelty. It's the familiarity. Wilkerson doesn't need to testify, he doesn't need to point, he doesn't need to defend himself. His role was never to accuse. It was to demonstrate what could happen. And demonstration is more efficient than enforcement. By the time his power wanes, the system no longer needs him. It sustains itself through fear, habit, and professional survival instinct. That's the part people rarely talk about. Systems built on silence don't collapse when the architect leaves. They persist. Decades later, Hollywood looks back on The Blacklist as a moral failure, a dark chapter with clear villains and victims. The narrative becomes clean, contained. But the true beginning doesn't sit in a courtroom or a headline. It sits in a back booth. A glass sweating onto polished wood. A joke that landed too accurately. A room that understood itself in an instant. The most lasting damage wasn't done by shouting names. It was done by teaching people to fear being named. And that fear didn't end when the lists did. It changed shape. Learned new language. Found new rooms. Even now, the industry still understands the rules taught that night. Speak carefully. Laugh appropriately. Remember who controls the mirror. Because Hollywood never stopped believing in invisible lists. It just stopped admitting they mattered. And that's why the joke still echoes not as humor but as instruction. A reminder that the most dangerous power in the room is rarely the loudest.